This is the Good Morning Isla 200 show.
This podcast was prepared by the fall 2023 cohort of Isla 200 Islamic Civilizations at McGill University.
Grab a warm drink and tune in as our presenters take you on a deep dive into Islamicate history with reflections on how they relate to contemporary Muslim life and culture.
Hello, Isla 200. My name is Naomi. I'm here with Tao, Walid, Ezra, and Mustaqim, and we're going to talk about the movie Battle of Algiers. Could you introduce the movie to us, Walid, please?
Yeah, sure. So the Battle of Algiers was made in 1966. It's an Italian-Algerian film that was co-written and directed by Gillo Pontecorvo. And so it's set during the Algerian War of Independence, which is 1954 to 1962, and it primarily takes place in Algiers, which is the capital city. And to give some historical context, France established colonial control over Algeria in 1830, and for over the next century it was considered an integral part of French territory. And the colonial rule there was characterized by economic exploitation, cultural assimilation, and the political marginalization of the Algerian population. And so in the mid-20th century is when we start to see the rise of the nationalist sentiments that we see in the movie. And specifically in Algeria, it's the National Liberation Front, or the FLN, which emerges in 1954, advocating for the end of French colonial rule and the establishment of an independent Algerian state.
Okay, and so what is the story of the movie?
Yeah, so the story of the movie takes place at the start of the War of Independence in 1954, when the FLN launches a series of attacks against the French military and civilian targets. And so the narrative of the movie captures this urban guerrilla warfare that takes place between the National Liberation Front and the French government forces as they try to quell the insurgency that takes place.
Okay. Tao, can I ask you a bit more about the style that the movie was shot in?
So the movie was kind of shot in a documentary style, so with a camera on the shoulder aesthetic, and the image is kind of like with a grain and is really, really contrasted like documentaries at the time. And this style gives a feeling of truth, of immediacy, and this, by the way, this kind of sentiment of authenticity made one of the American producers to put a disclaimer that it wasn't real images and it wasn't a documentary but an actual film. So yeah, this is kind of how it was shot.
Wow, that's interesting. I guess that gives us also maybe indices on how it was received. Maybe, Walid, can you give us an input on how the critics responded to that movie?
Yeah, so internationally, over the years, critics definitely responded well, and it was received a lot of awards for innovative cinematic techniques that Tao was talking about, and the ability of the movie to capture how complex war is, and it received a lot of awards. But when it was first released, there was a lot of controversy and censorship, and there was some bans in several countries, and lots of governments, especially with colonial histories, were wary of the film's potential to incite social unrest and political activism. And I think Ezra kind of can delve more into the actual influence of the film too.
I think what we see is, as mentioned, there was a heavy critical response, and I think one thing that should be noted is that famously in 1967 at the Venice Film Festival, the French delegation, with some very notable people, including Francois Truffaut, walked out in protest of the film's showing. And I think from there we see its sort of radical roots, although these are co-opted later. In its initial sort of release, I guess you could say, it was seen as a rallying cry for revolutionary and as a force for change. I think you see famously the Weather Underground, who were a left-wing terrorist group in the United States, saw this as a model of how revolution should be brought about. And also you see, but where it really gained more significance is in groups such as the Black Panthers, who see this movie not necessarily as a manual for terror, I guess you could say, but as a means to bring about liberation, and as an example of a liberatory movement that, though not emulated directly through terrorism, should be emulated in its goals and its broader aims, I think you could say.
Walid, can you tell us a bit more about the response in Algeria?
Yeah, so initially the Algerian government also distanced itself because it wanted to maintain diplomatic relations with those countries that Ezra was talking about that were like pushing the film away. But over time, the film gained a lot of recognition in Algeria, and it became kind of like a powerful representation of the country's struggle for independence, and became more acceptable to watch. And I think what's also interesting would be like the French perspective, where it generated a lot of debate there about the ethics of colonialism. And what's also interesting is the French perspective. So in France, it generated a lot of debate about like the ethics of colonialism, and like if the film fairly portrayed the France's military conduct and like the actual situation was there. And a lot of people praised its anti-colonial stance, while a lot of people thought it was more biased. And that's reflected in like things like the education system in France and other things.
Thank you for that insight. On that subject, Tao, can you maybe give us a little more information about how it was received in France, and especially in education?
The war in Algeria is for France a really, really dark part of their history that they kind of tried to hide, and it was a lot taboo. And this is clearly seen in the way that the French educational system takes it, because the war isn't talked about a lot. For instance, I was in the French system for 6 years, and we almost didn't talk about it. We talked about it in my geopolitics class, and not everybody has geopolitics class. So it means that only a fraction of people in France had this class. And even with that, to be honest, I don't feel comfortable. And before seeing the film, with all the vocabulary, I wasn't comfortable with talking about the Algeria war, because I didn't feel like I learned a lot. Because officially in France, the Algeria war is supposed to be in the secondary system, and it's been written since 1983, but we don't talk about that much. But more on the political side, France hasn't talked about it for years a lot, and recognized only the war with Algeria and the atrocities that France did in Algeria only last year. So it took a lot of time, and before that it was something that wasn't talked about at all. And you can be, as Walid and Ezra said, there was a lot of censorship, and the film was presented at Cannes only in 2002, so 40 years afterwards. So this is how it was kind of welcomed in France.
So when you talk about Cannes, you talk about the Cannes Film Festival?
Yes,
I understand. Yes, that's true. I also was scholarized in France, and I talked a bit about the Algeria war, but I feel like watching that movie was the first real step of my education on this conflict.
Same.
And that's interesting, because even today, where it's not censored anymore, it's a subject that we're supposed to be talking about more, the movie still provides education.
And I also think that, like, in a North American context, even we're given this picture of colonialism, and specifically decolonization, that predicts it like World War II ended and everyone realized colonialism was bad, and so we're gonna all leave our colonial possessions. And I think what the Battle of Algiers also serves to do is highlight that this was not by any means a peaceful process. This was not purely by choice of the European and North American countries. This was forced upon them by liberatory movements within the countries themselves.
Okay, thank you so much. And so I think right now maybe we will dive a bit more into the story that the movie is telling. Mustaqim, what can you tell us about the characters that are in the movie?
Well, what I can really say is like there's no particular main characters in the movie. as we've seen, like the movie focusing on Ali, Jafar, and then Colonel Matthew, and then some of their friends and families, but they particularly didn't show the lives of one character, but they rather focused on the movement of the characters. So and what the Moroccans did as a whole, as to the characters themselves.
I think you mean the Algerians.
Yes.
Okay. Ezra, do you want to add on to that reflection?
Yeah, I think what we do see is there is no definitive main character, but what we see in this is characters who represent broader positions. And I think most notably Colonel Mathieu, who represents the French presence and is the head of the French military in Algeria. But then with that, we also see depictions of other people in this conflict. We see with Ali, though he rises to high up in the organization, we see the characteristic of a revolutionary soldier rather than the character of one. We see their aspects and so on. And similarly with Jafar, we see a revolutionary commander and the broader leadership, or as a symbol for the broader leadership of the FLN. And I think what this serves to do is it serves to paint a broader picture of the conflict than perhaps if they were to focus on a single character, what that might have been able to achieve. And I think, furthermore, to bring it back somewhat to the French presence, we see through Matthew the characteristic of the characterization of the French position towards Algeria, and this is broadly an Orientalist position. They condense the Islamic people within Algeria into this very small box. They all exist as a threat. They all, just by their existence as Muslims in Algeria, and I think this helps to characterize the colonial dynamic that is very much one of opposition. There can be no collaboration between the Algerians and the French because, for the French, the Algerians are necessarily in opposition to them.
Thank you for that. One subject that it seemed interesting to me is also that we have those three main characters, and then we have the population. We have people passing through the screen, either staying for longer or not, but those represent civilians. What can you say about this, about the presence of civilians in this movie?
Yeah, I think we see two distinct groups of civilians in movies: the French civilians and then the Algerian citizens. And I think it serves to heighten the cost of colonialism, because we see the French response to the FLN's actions is immense crackdowns, not on because they can't attack a specific FLN person, as we see sort of through the depictions. We see that they're forced to attack, or I shouldn't say forced. They choose to attack all Algerian Muslims as a whole, and I think we see in this sort of the immense cost of these liberatory wars for freedom, because in the FLN's, I would say, noble goals of freeing the Algerian people from colonialism, we see an immense amount of civilian casualties. And largely these are, I think, in the movie, it's somewhat disingenuously displayed as a major campaign of French civilian death, which of course did happen. But significantly, hundreds of thousands of Algerians died in this anti-colonial fight. And so I think with what civilians sort of illustrate is the human cost of this war, and that, like, even though we can recognize it is a just cause, even still these conflicts take an immense toll on the average person within these countries.
Thank you for that. I think it's really interesting. What we can see also is that maybe in this war, what each side is trying to do is to dehumanize the other side, to make those acts of terrorism or torture easier to act, and easier to act on your ideals when you don't have humans in front of you but enemies. And what do you think about the movie maybe portraying this, but also bringing back the human side with showing us the lives of people in both sides?
I think it does this quite well. I think most notably with Matthew, where he goes about this in a very methodical, sort of process-oriented thing. And in this, he dehumanizes them because for the colonel, it is purely an operation. It is a military operation. It is an operation. Okay, this is our job. We're just following orders. We see with Matthew someone who is civilian lives are essentially irrelevant. They are the only thing preventing him from succeeding, or at least as he sees, succeeding in his task. And I think similarly, we see on the FLN side, we see a similar dehumanization of the French citizens. And on a certain level, this becomes empathetic, but because you see the French civilians participating and collaborating with the French military in the oppression of Algerians. But at the same time, we are reminded with the scenes of immense violence in the bombings, of the fact that though they are to some extent collaborators, they are not equivalent to the French military, and they still remain human beings, and it is still a catastrophic toll nonetheless, despite their role in the colonialism.
Yes, I think this movie tells the story of civilians caught in the middle, and which is a tragic story that we find in a lot of wars. On this subject of seeing someone either as a human, as a victim, as a threat, Tao, can you please tell us a bit more about this subject of seeing? And for this part, we are going to switch to French.
Les Algériens vont se soustraire à ce regard panoptique par la tactique. Et ça va être illustré par la scène des femmes qui s'habillent. Donc les femmes dans cette scène s'habillent pour pouvoir ressembler à des femmes européennes et après mettre des bombes dans le quartier européen. Cette scène, elle est filmée en plongée, comme dans la théorie originelle de la panoptique où le garde est surélevé. Donc les spectateurs peuvent les voir se changer et les surveiller sans être vus. Donc là, on est dans la position du garde. Et donc dans les scènes habituelles où les femmes se pouponnent, se préparent, c'est un petit peu pour un désir de satisfaire le spectateur. Ici, elles prennent davantage pour pouvoir tromper le spectateur. Et on voit que la résistance et la tactique des Algériens fonctionne parce que les femmes ne sont pas soupçonnées d'être entre guillemets des terroristes, parce que dans une scène, on va voir le colonel qui montre une vidéo qui a été filmée à leur insu, donc toujours dans cette volonté de panoptique de la part des Français de voir sans être vus, et on voit la femme qui s'est habillée en européenne quelques scènes avant dans la vidéo.
Merci beaucoup, effectivement c'est intéressant. I'm going to switch back to English and maybe ask you, Ezra, the question of what is the importance of the Islamic law, the Sharia, in this movie and more generally in the actions of the FLN?
Yeah, I think what we see depicted in this movie slightly, we see the enforcement in the Kasbah of restrictions on alcohol consumption. And I think, but what broadly I think this represents is a Sharia and Islamic law, more broadly, having to adapt to sort of the modern conceptions of the world, because very clearly the FLN, despite their Islamist backgrounds, are not enforcing the letter of the law. And I think this also is emphasized by Khalaq's theory that states that Sharia cannot exist in the modern state system. And I think what this tells us about Islam in relation to the FLN and the movie especially is that Islam is used broadly in a cultural sense. So it is in fact more similar, the Islam being referred to is more of Islamic hate rather than Islam as a religious doctrine. We see this as Islam is the uniting force of the Algerians beyond just prayer. It is the rallying cry of the liberatory forces. And I think this is especially poignant at the end of the film, where we see the final protests of the Algerian national movement and the final protesters waving flags with the crescent moon on it, one of the key symbols of Islam. And I think in this we see Islam transcending just our traditional understandings of Sharia. We also see this in terms of how it relates to how Islam relates to the Siras, and in the sense that we see Islam in the biographies of the Prophet as a liberatory force. It is not in the context of a Western view of a repressive system, but it is instead, like in the Battle of Algiers, Islam is used as a force for liberation rather than the traditional Orientalist perspective that Islam is a repressive force in society rather than an egalitarian liberatory movement.
Interesting. And I would add to that one scene that I found was really striking in the movie is when one prisoner in the prisons at the beginning is walking to his death. He's going to be executed, and he is yelling Allahu Akbar in the prison, and everyone is yelling with him. And it is religion as a cry of resistance to the oppressive system of colonialism. Thank you very much, Ezra, for that. Maybe what we can switch now to is, as you talked about, the life of the Prophet, the Siras. Mustaqim, can you tell us a bit more about the link between the Battle of Algiers and the wars that the Prophet fought?
Yes, sure. But the thing that I found common between the wars Prophet fought and in the Battle of Algiers was that the Algiers themselves, they didn't attack the French first, but only after facing attacks themselves and tortures. They sort of launched a guerrilla attack. Responded with a guerrilla attack, and they attacked the French, but they didn't torture them or they didn't harm them in any other ways. Just they wanted to make sure that they didn't face such problems later in their lives. And what I saw with after reading some of the articles and reading the biography by Omid Safi, that Muhammad was questioned again and again from his enemies, like Abu Jahil and Al-Nadir, that even like Islam is a religion of peace, then why are you guys attacking us? So his response was that we have been driven out of Mecca, and we don't have much people remaining, so but you guys want to kill us and you want to drive us away from our land. So we received the permission from God to protect ourselves from the attack.
Interesting, thank you. Ezra, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I think when we see that sort of common thread with the wars of the Prophet, in that, as Mr. Kim mentioned, these are wars that are being fought, or on the Algerian side, this is a war for freedom. They are not fighting to oppress another group. Yes, French civilians are killed, but this is fundamentally, actions are done in service of liberatory aims, and I think we see this as Mr. Kim described in the Prophet. The people, the followers of Muhammad, were forced to go on hijrah, and similarly in the Battle of Algiers, we see people who they are, at the very least, they view themselves as being forced into this situation, and I would argue that they are. They are perpetually in a state of oppression, similar to in the biography of the Prophet, we see the Muslims in Mecca. They are not fighting out of a desire for out of bloodlust. They are fighting for their own freedoms, and I think that is the greatest commonality with the Siras and the Battle of Algiers.
Thank you very much. I think to put an end to our podcast, we'll go through two more comparisons. We'll start with some similarities to another conflict that took place between Bangladesh and Pakistan. Mustaqim, can you give us more insight about that?
Yeah, so there were a couple of similarities. So I think one of them were like how Algerians were being oppressed. The Bengali people were also being oppressed by the Pakistani people, and they were also being tortured. They were also being they were also being controlled in various ways. But despite this happening, during the wars, Bengali civilians they formed up their own army. Like they weren't trained as the Algerians. They weren't also trained, as we could see in the movie. They formed what you'd call is the Muktijuddhas, or the freedom fighters. So what they did was they also adopted the guerrilla tactics, and they went under the Pakistani army, and then they just killed people who were responsible for the deaths of other innocent Bengali civilians, so that they could reduce the number of casualties, but they didn't torture or harm the other Pakistani people, as they wanted to be the better Muslim. Despite Pakistanis also being Muslims, they weren't as religious or strict Muslims compared to the Bengali people. So what they wanted to portray was, like, since Islam is a peaceful religion, we want to like save ourselves, fight for our freedom, but we won't harm innocent Pakistani soldiers.
Thank you very much. The similarity is so strong that we confuse the countries. To close our debate, I'd like us to talk about something a bit more actual, which is the conflict between Israel and Palestine. How it can be viewed as similar to the conflict between France and Algeria, and also how it is viewed today in Montreal.
Okay, so yeah, I think we all have a decent understanding of what is happening in Israel right now, but what I would really like to talk about is how it's perceived by us in Montreal as McGill students. And this will be political, and these are my opinions, I would say. And I think what we see from McGill a real equivocation of the sides, much akin to the French portrayal of the liberatory war in Algeria, where we see the FLN, a group of civilians, is portrayed as an equivalent force to the French colonial army. And I think we see this in the Israeli-Palestine conflict, where the two sides, though gravely different in terms of power, are portrayed as equals, and this provides a somewhat disingenuous view of the conflict. And then, furthermore, I would say that we have an issue where the similar concepts that we have of the East, best expressed by Orientalism, are applied to the Palestinians in terms of to depict them as savages in a certain way. To depict them as savages and subhuman. We see this the utilization of the fact that they're Muslim to depict them as as lesser and as less deserving of what they are fighting for, I guess I would say. And I think similarly we see in a Montreal context we see the smearing of protesters broadly. Like, the protests are viewed not as people acting in solidarity with an oppressed group, but often is as a anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic action. And this is this is similar in the Battle of Algiers, where the fact that Islam is so characterized as a violent force in Western media through things like the War on Terror, we see that people who are acting in solidarity are destroyed. They are framed in such a way that they are completely incorrect, that they are in fact acting in favor of genocide. And I think we see here is similar to the Algerians, where the French are portrayed in the Algerian conflict. As we see with the French reporters, the French are portrayed as the victims in this conflict, despite the fact that it's their colonial oppression that brings about this conflict.
Thank you for that comparison and for sharing your opinion on it. Walid, maybe you want us to close. Maybe you can help us wrap it up.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on to what Ezra was saying about So what I thought was also interesting is that like many critics from throughout the years have engaged in a discourse about how the film's portrayal of violence was like a little questionable, and whether it was glorifying or condemning the actions of both sides. And I think that this movie, like the refusal to provide easy answers, is like has contributed to the lasting impact about like why we're still talking about it today, why it's still relevant today, and why we can see these similarities between what's like this geopolitical conflict in Palestine and what's happening now. And yeah, and I think like what I thought was interesting is that like as humans, it's like easier to watch things or like see conflicts where there's like a protagonist or antagonist or someone that like is an aggressor, and that like in reality war isn't very simple and clean. And although we see France as the aggressor and the occupier, for me at least, the film forces you to like confront lines in humanity where like when does it go too far? Is there even like a line, like can you go too far when it comes to like your freedom and like very basic human rights? I think that's very interesting, and that basically ties into everything Ezra was saying about how people are questioning like the tactics used like to fight back. But honestly, like it's an interesting discussion about the lines in humanity and like when it goes too far. And yeah,
thank you very much, that's very interesting, and with that we end.
This podcast was prepared by the Fall 2023 cohort of ISLA 200 Islamic Civilizations at McGill University.